Attention, attention. Action this day. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Dunkirk week and a bit special. James Holland and I, of course, we're trying to take us through, without too much digression, though we failed miserably yesterday, the events of the most important week in modern history. Let's go modern history. But,
yeah, I think that's fair enough.
You know, it's the modern stuff that, let's be honest now, the modern stuff matters more, doesn't it? I mean, It's not like your brother scraping around in Thermopylae or somewhere. This is
who
it.
cares?
This is
who cares? Who cares? You know, bunch of bloody Spartans. This is much more important. But anyway,
deal.
so for me, Monday the 27th of May it's the daddy of all days, because this is the closest, in my humble opinion, that Britain gets to losing the war. It's really fascinating. You know, so this is the day that King Leopold of the Belgians decides that he's going to sue for an armistice. So suddenly the Belgians are going to be out. Now the Belgians are holding the whole northwest flank of the northern bit of the pocket. So that's going to have to be filled overnight when the armistice comes into play early in the hours of the 28th. So that's got to be dealt with. Dunkirk is being absolutely hammered by bombers. All along, protecting this kind of sort of lozenge. It basically looks a bit like a kind of ice lolly on its side, like a Zoom ice lolly. That's what it looks like. And the southern flank is being held together by some pockets of defence, one of which is on this little hill that sticks out in the middle of nowhere, castle. So that is where the Germans start attacking this. And early in the morning, with the halt order lifted, that is when the panzers start going back into action. Royal Navy ships which have come overnight to Dunkirk are now being shelled by the Germans on land,
because they're within artillery range.
They've turned the guns round from the kind of Panigale, from Gravelines, and they're turning them on Dunkirk. So that is not a good start to the day for Churchill at 7:15 a.m. over his boiled egg and soldiers. At 9 a.m, Captain Bill Tennant reports to Admiral Ramsay, who is Commander-in-Chief of Dover Command, and Ramsay's got the responsibility of looking after Operation Dynamo. And what Ramsay recognises is that he's going to need a first-class senior naval officer over the other side of the channel. So he sends, he's asked Bill Tennant, who he knows is a very competent, very capable, highly experienced sailor, but also very good staff officer. He reports to Ramsay. They have a conference in the tunnels there in the cliffs at Dover, and Ramsay says to him, look, you know, if you can get 40,000 men out, you know, you'll be doing well, but you need to get your ass over there now. He gets at that point there is 11:30 in the morning is the first major proper war cabinet, and Chamberlain, the ex-Prime Minister, reports on the Chief of Staff's report a certain eventuality, and a certain eventuality is if the whole thing collapses and the Germans try an invasion. That is what they are dealing with at the War Cabinet that morning. You know, and I simply cannot think of a more gut-wrenching, heart-stopping, dead weight on your shoulders feeling than being one of the 5 men in that War Cabinet having to discuss seriously what would happen when the Germans invade. It's
fascinating that it's Chamberlain, though, that's got that role, isn't it? It's so interesting. I mean, it's a lot to do with the fact that he's still leader of the Conservative Party. He might not be Prime Minister anymore, but that Churchill's got him doing that, I think, is really interesting. That obviously Churchill needs him close to him to carry the government, but must also rate him. And he must trust him, even though he's supplanted him. And it's fascinating that he's in there, because you know in modern politics you'd think he'd when he'd have gone to Dubai by now, wouldn't he? Be on holiday. He'd have buggered off, wouldn't he? And he's not well either, really. So he's
got cancer. He doesn't know he's got cancer at this point. So that's another myth of darkest hour, that he has no idea. And it is this point in this meeting, having had this discussion on what we do when the Germans invade, and when everything has gone absolutely pear-shaped, that Halifax brings up the fact that he's been having all these talks with Bastianini. And he says, look, Bastianini is prepared to kind of, you know, we can pursue the possibility of peace talks through the Italians. And Churchill says, look, that's really not going to work. And Halifax says, look, obviously, if the terms aren't favourable, then we discard them. But we're in the creek, we're in a massive stew. Let's at least consider it.
Yeah.
Churchill again disagrees with them, and they just park it for the time being. And the cabinet breaks up. They go off and do whatever they've got to do, attend to papers, listen to reports. Yep. Hastings Ismay has to report to Churchill and all the rest of it. There's other kind of government matters and updates that need to come in. Meanwhile, Bill Tennant has set off on HMS Wolfhound using the Y route. There's 3 routes that they use, all of which are a lot longer than... There's one that kind of goes up to the Dutch coast and Doglegs back. That's a bit dangerous. There's another one that kind of goes south. There's another one that has to kind of go through the minefields. They're all none of them are great, but all of them are substantially longer than a direct sailing route.
To hop across the channel.
They've got to go through dodge minefields and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So he gets going. And actually, an hour into his journey, he's attacked by Stukas on HMS Wolfhound. The Stukas come in and start, bombs start falling all around it. But he gets through it. Then at 4:30 is the second war cabinet, and this is the big one. This is the moment where reports are coming in. None of it is good. None of it is good at all. I can report to you that senior naval officers going to Dunkirk. Guns are firing on Dunkirk itself. These routes aren't very, very good. We're expecting Dunkirk to be able to hold out for another 24 hours, maybe 36 hours if we're lucky. And at this point, Halifax, and you have to say, you can understand where he's coming from, goes, listen, I know you dismissed the talks with Bastianini, but they're there. They're on the table. Why on earth don't we consider them? And Churchill says, because once you open the door ajar, it blows wide open and there is no turning back. The moment you even do this, you have put yourself in a position where you cannot come back from that. It's all over. And at this point, Halifax loses his temper. And he says, you're impossible. I do not understand what you're saying. This is absolutely ridiculous. And if you don't change your tune, I'm going to have to seriously consider my position. And what that means is I am threatening to resign. Now, you have to remember that Halifax is the most respected politician in the country. Well, he is known for having a clear head, a sound, whereas Churchill is not.
Well, and also he is absolutely 100% establishment, isn't he? I mean, he's friends 100%. With the royal family. I mean...
key to Buckingham Garden Palace.
Exactly, all that, Garden. And were he not a Viscount, were he not in the Lords, he'd probably be Prime Minister.
Yes.
And there would have been zero obstacle to him taking that job. So I mean, it is interesting because it's an expanded war cabinet, isn't it? The 4:30 because Sinclair's there and they've got who's the leader of the Liberals is there because they obviously know they're gonna need everyone on board for whatever decision. Churchill knows he's going to need everyone on board for whatever decision he's going to have to make, and Sinclair agrees with Churchill, doesn't he? He says we can't. The moment, and it is this idea also that we're still allies with France.
Right.
So if we start trying to talk on a back channel to Italy, we undermine the
we look completely perfidious. We look absolutely hopeless.
Yeah, we're totally untrustworthy. And what we need down the line is to be able to go to the Americans and say, for instance, look, we're stand-up guys and we behaved ourselves even when the chips were really down. We didn't desert the French because obviously if you're evacuating, it does look awfully like you're deserting the French, doesn't it?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
It does it looks terribly like that from a different perspective.
Which is exactly what they are doing. They would be doing.
Exactly.
It doesn't just look like it. They are.
Of course, but so politically, what you've got to do is not offer a political wedge here for someone to go, well, you're doing, and I think in a strange way, this is what informs unconditional surrender later on in the war, isn't it? It's that there are no deals, there are no back doors, there are no back channels. Although some Germans try, they always get nowhere in 45.
Of course,
with this because this is. This moment is the germ of that idea, I think, of that approach. That if you, like you say, if you just open the door, it'll blow just ajar, it'll blow wide open. But so fascinating
in that meeting is, and this is the really, really crucial thing, and this is why Darkest Hour is such a complete travesty. Chamberlain agrees with Churchill.
Yeah.
Chamberlain says, actually, Edward, Lord Halifax, this is why we can't do this. And it's exactly the point you've just made. How would that look to the French? We can't do this. And Churchill then says, look, let's all just take a breather and have a cup of tea. Edward, why don't you come with me into the garden? Because they're not in the cabinet war rooms. They never go into the cabinet war room. The first cabinet that is held in the war rooms underneath is not till the 18th of July 1940. So the whole premise of Darkest Hour film is bollocks. Anyway, but they are at number 10, even though Chamberlain is still living in number 10. And Churchill is not. But the War Cabinet is held at number 10. Churchill takes Halifax out into the garden at number 10 and they have a chat. And no one knows what was said. It's one of those things. We were talking about this the other day, weren't we, about threatening to reveal the truth about his Labrador.
But who knows what it was?
Who knows what it was? It doesn't matter. The point is...
No, of course not, no.
But the point is, the situation is diffused. The cabinet then breaks up. While this conversation is going on, that is precisely the moment that the 2nd Norfolk's headquarters company is overrun. They've run out of ammunition. They surrender to the Totenkopf. And 101 of them are taken to Le Paradis, this farmyard in Le Paradis, which is just down the road from where the house where they've been holed up. They're put against the wall, and all of them are shot. 2 managed to escape. 19 are killed at that moment. So that is the world that, that is the threat. Yeah. That is what's going, and that is a tiny thing, of course, compared to what's going to happen in the Holocaust and all the rest of it. So when subsequently Churchill does his talk and says, if we prevail, we can return to sunlit uplands, but if we don't, we will descend into a new dark age made more sinister by the perversions of modern science. He's absolutely bang on the money. That's what we're talking about. Yeah. Just after that, 10 minutes after those, about the same time that those guys are being shot against the wall, that's when Wolfhound reaches Dunkirk. And Bill Tennant arrives, reports to Admiral Abriel, the French admiral in Bastion 32, a bunker at Dunkirk, and they kind of start working out the plan. What is really interesting is later on that night, about 10 o'clock, is the 3rd War Cabinet, and that is nothing to do with talks with Bastianini or anything like that. That is all about the Belgian surrender. And what are they going to do about that? And overnight, what is happening to Gort also knows this. Gort, who's Field Marshal Lord Gort, is obviously Commander-in-Chief of the BEF. He has asked Montgomery, who is commander of the 3rd Division, to move 50 miles overnight and fill in the gap left by the Belgian armistice. Yeah. And that is carried out that night. Also, at the same time, so that is a brilliantly executed operation, which probably only Montgomery could have done. And his team.
Well, and it's one of the things that then
sets him on the way.
That sets him on the way. Is how prepared his division is for that, because he's been rehearsing that.
Absolutely, and you can say whatever you like about Monty, but that moment is brilliant. He is brilliant. He absolutely calm, clear-headed, well-organised staff work gets the job done, and it's brilliantly executed. Around the same time as the 3rd Cabinet's going on and Monty's starting his movement of 3rd Division, Bill Tennant moves up to the front and sees the East Mole and sees that there is this wooden lattice mole, this jetty, this pier that extends out over a mile out into out of the harbour. And he goes, I wonder what would happen if we put a boat along here. And so he signals to HMS Wolfhound, the destroyer that he's brought in on, and says, can you send someone in? And they send in the Queen of the Channel, which is a cross-channel ferry. And it moors up against the jetty and nothing happens. It barely creaks. And they just think, holy moly, we've got a result here. You can forget kind of trying to scrabble people into little ships, take them and ferry them out to the big ships out at sea. We can not just double back this, we can triple deck this and stack them up. And we can just follow them straight on and straight off.
And also at that cabinet meeting is Duff Cooper for the Ministry of Information, who is there to talk about. He's told about what's going on, and then he's told to think about what you're going to tell the public.
That's right.
Because let's not forget, the day before you've had a day of prayer, everyone knows now that the BEF is needing to get out, and he's told to lower expectations. He's told, in fact, to not really let the public know what's going on until it's clear whether Dynamo is going to be a success or a failure, which I think is fascinating. Yeah. That we think of news management as a modern political manifestation, but right in the jaws of this, they're all over that. They're all over trying to keep that, keep control of that information and expectation. Because after all, as you said, this is rock bottom. This is the day that the war could have been lost.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an amazing day. I really think it is. I just think God, what would have happened if that afternoon, that 4:30 war cabinet meeting had gone a different way? It's just,
and Churchill hadn't been able to persuade Halifax.
Yeah.
Then what? Yeah.
Exactly. But anyway, so that's the end of the 27th of Monday, the 27th of May, 1940. And of course, key to the whole Operation Dynamo is the Royal Navy, which is why we've got Steve Prince back, head of the Naval Historical Branch, to give us a little bit of kind of background and perspective and kind of where we stand with the Royal Navy during that critical week.
Brilliant. Achtung, Achtung. Hello, dear listeners. I hope you've been enjoying the content James and I have been serving up this past year. If you have enjoyed it, and you felt so inclined, could we ask you to consider voting for us in this year's podcast awards? There's a special award that's got nothing to do with juries and industry professionals. It's called the Listeners Award. You need to go to British Podcast Awards/vote. Then put in We Have Ways and up we pop. Prove you're not a robot. You know you can do it. And make sure to confirm your vote in the email they send to you. Many thanks from me and James and everyone at the We Have Ways team.
Where does the Royal Navy sit in the Second World War at this stage? What is the impact of the naval victory at Norway? What does that have on subsequent operations at Dunkirk? Because I've always kind of thought, well, what the hell are the Germans doing attacking Norway before France? Because if they get France, they'll just be able to walk into Norway. You don't have to have that hassle. You don't have to have that potential loss of resources which they lose in Norway. I think it'd be worth talking about that, don't you, Al?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the thing is of all the three services, after all, the Navy in peacetime is the one that's most sort of globally involved in a way that the Army never can. The Army can't actually go round practice. It's not like the Cold War where there was an expectation of what would happen next and you were lined up to do it. The Army in the British Army in peacetime has got this is wearing so many hats as an imperial sort of not police force, not quite the right word, but as the Imperial Army presence. And also is trying to simultaneously forget all about the First World War because it was so ghastly, and also learn the lessons from it. And it's having a sort of wearing schizophrenic moment, to use the vernacular, in dealing with that. But the Navy is the thing that's kind of just carrying on being a global presence, doing its Royal Navy thing. And after all, you can practice sailing to a cape as quickly as possible in peacetime in a way that an army can't really actually gain experience of rapid deployment and stuff. Yeah, would you agree with that? So the Navy's sort of got the most. Its sinews are the closest to being ready for war of the three services, possibly.
No, I think that's fair. So the Navy, particularly as you say, there's obviously the revulsion after the First World War. There's a certain amount of never again that develops into war. So the Navy, is the senior service, the imperial service. Particularly with the economic shocks of the 1930s, actually the imperial economic ties become even more important. And the sort of the glue of the empire is the Royal Navy to tie it together. So there are all sorts of debates about how many cruisers the Royal Navy needs, and they're all based on, right, if you've got so many on the Australian station and so many in the Med, what does that up to? There's a real kind of consensus about the Royal Navy. And so the Royal Navy does relatively well out of the limited amount of spending through the 20s and 30s. There's a view that the Navy is also the defence of the nation. So as we know, it's only in the spring of 1939 that we actually agree we're going to send a second BEF to France. So, as you say, there is no really agreed game plan for the Army until very shortly before the war. So the Navy knows it's going to have to kind of hold the ring. And one of the things I think that's important for the Navy and the Air Force between the wars is there's a real political worry. Anything that gets you towards rearmament, fine, that may have to be accepted in the 30s, Japan, Italy, Germany. But every political party is either desperately worried about or utterly opposed to conscription and any shadow of conscription. And if you expand the army very much, you very soon get to that. Hence the attraction to some extent of the Air Force and the Navy. The other thing, I think, is the Navy, the big platforms that you need, the aircraft carriers and the battleships, there's a 4 or 5 year lead time on. So while you can extemporise a certain amount of an army really quite quickly, particularly if if you've got lots of infantry battalions, you can kind of take a cadre out of one and generate another infantry battalion in 6 or 9 months. You can't really do that with the major naval platforms. So I think for all those reasons, it sort of stands in its favour. And then the Navy in 39, its job really is secure the imperial and the trade routes. Because we know Britain's long-term advantage. Right? And blockade Germany, absolutely. So again, we're very conscious of the record of the First World War, and this takes us to the Norway debate. So Germany is equally conscious that while they have good Central European resources, they don't have much access to the world seas, either to get stuff for themselves or to seriously threaten our own trade and supply lines. So a lot of the attraction and the push from the German Navy says, if you could get Norway, that gives you a real sort of spout of access to the world seas. That means we could fundamentally change the scale of threat against Britain. We'll be able to wage a real maritime war against them. Because previously we basically put a minefield across the channel, and in 1918 we were constructing, mainly the US Navy, a minefield across the North Sea. So it's the idea that you could basically pen in the Germans with things you do. Yep. So the corvettes that we all know, Compass Rose from the Cruel Sea, corvettes were designed to work in the North Sea, because it was thought that would be where your main battle would be against the German Navy. You wanted to stop them getting into the Atlantic in the first place. So you concentrate on that. So the German attack on Norway is driven partly by that. And as you guys know, it's also to do with Germany's difficulty with industrial resources. So iron ore from Sweden, ball bearings and these sort of things. Yep. And there was a few that, would you secure them? And of course, they're quite right that Britain was seriously considering and was just on the edge of interfering with Norway and preventing the trade in an effort to try and, choke the German economy. And that's what drives them to Norway. And I think Norway is really interesting, James, because kind of the Norwegian campaign, you're dead right. If France falls, other things, we think the Channel Islands went without a fight. Norway and Denmark would be surely relatively easy to pick off if you'd already got France.
Yeah, they could literally just walk in, couldn't they? I mean...
Yeah, almost certainly. So one of the things I think Norway shows us is the Germans are not expecting quite the scale of success that they get in the summer of 1940. They might be hoping for it, but they can't kind of seriously expect it. So there is an element that the Germans are sort of themselves surprised with just how well it goes in those few weeks in May. The strategic earthquake, Hitler has an interest in saying, I knew it was going to happen all along. But I think an awful lot of Germans are shocked at just how well it goes.
No, they're completely staggered, but it's also what then trips Hitler into making further strategic decisions that don't add up. That he thinks he can do it again against the Soviet Union, and he's quite wrong. And because James talks about this, we've talked about this an awful lot. Just the difference in the geographic space and the fact that French villages have petrol pumps in them in the way that there aren't any villages for tens and scores of miles in Russian steppe, or Ukrainian steppe. So the strategic. You're right. The earthquake cuts both ways, doesn't it? In fact, it surprises everyone.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, and it gives Germany. It's ironic, it set the seeds for Germany's defeat because it gives Hitler on such a high, and he's, as far as he's concerned, effectively not finished the war in the West, but closed off any serious threat because he thinks even if Britain holds out, Britain will never be able to mount another invasion or an invasion back in. And that's the thing that gives him the opportunity that ideologically, for all sorts of reasons, the war that he really wants to fight, which is the war against Russia for living room, for food supply access, for oil access in a big way, because our maritime economy, our great strength, the vulnerabilities, it comes in ships you can sink, but we are able to draw on things like oil, 80% of the world's oil from all around the world. We either have imperial control or commercial interests or trade. Germany
most oil comes from... The two leading oil producers in the world in the Second World War are Venezuela and the United States, and they're both the right side of the sea for us. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that oil moves around the world today largely by ship, and it did in the 1940s largely by ship, which is something that the Germans don't have. So even if they do get into kind of the Caucasus or whatever, they're still going to have a massive problem of how to get it from A to B, because there aren't pipelines or anything in those days. But just to go back to Norway, I mean, because Norway is a victory and defeat for Germany. It's obviously it's a massive victory on land, as is Denmark. But it's a naval defeat, isn't it? And that has its ramifications for what follows in the following month. The defeat of the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, in April 1940, really has an effect on the ability of the Kriegsmarine to do much about the Dunkirk evacuation, doesn't it?
I think it absolutely does. So the thing it does is effectively the German surface fleet. So the losses, the naval losses, if you like, British and German in the Norwegian campaign, they're very different in which vessels and stuff, but they're sort of even over the course of the campaign. But the difference is that's half of the German surface fleet as opposed to about 5% of the Royal Navy. So the impact is utterly kind of disproportionate. Yeah. So they achieve the mission and achieve it spectacularly, really successfully. But their ability to grow their navy is really, really hard hit by that. Because it's not just the ships, it's those long-term regular officers who in other navies and air forces will become those who operate, but then they're the ones who run the training programs when you massively ramp up your numbers. And if you've taken those away, you've taken away sort of years and years of experience and judgment. And so it becomes, in the long run, you see that there are issues increasingly with U-boat crews, with people transferred and with reserve officers.
Yeah. And it also happens with that there's those terrible 2 months. I think it's March through to May 1941, where they lose the 3 leading U-boat aces. They lose Shepka, Preen, and Kretschmer. They're just gone. They are gone forever. That's it. You've taken those 3 most experienced guys and taken them out of the equation, and they're completely irreplaceable. And if you look at the kind of effectiveness of U-boats in terms of U-boats per day, tonnage sunk, the graph is going down throughout the war. The days when U-boats as individual boats were effective are in 1939-40. And one of the reasons they're effective in 1939-40 is because a lot of the destroyers have either gone to Ramsey in the short term or are being held off the south coast through that summer into the winter of 1940 against invasion. That gives the Germans a bit of an opportunity. But as you say, the key thing is the Germans, that they have virtually no navy to interfere with Dunkirk. And this is one of, I think, the issues with the Germans, fundamentally, is the British have all sorts of inter-service rivalries and, rivalries between the generals and this sort of thing. But in the end, they cooperate. And there's a Chiefs of Staffs committee where the sailor, the general, and the airman all sit down and kind of thrash things out and have a bit of common purpose. In Germany, it's just not like that. It's all about a series of competing commanders and services trying to get to Hitler, trying to get the best possible deal, or the Fuhrer said this and then run out and get some advantage with it. So I think there's very little German navy, and there was just no mindset of the German army to think, actually, what we need to do now is coordinate with the navy. So it's the absolute opposite of what the British Royal Navy and the army, through their training and service together, who are instinctively getting together under pressure at Dunkirk. That just doesn't even occur, I think, to the various German high commanders.
But that's a product of running a global empire where you need to take soldiers to you've got to get Clive into Montreal or whatever. It's as old as that. It's as meshed together as that. Yeah. And the Air Force is the new kid on the block, but has come out of the army anyway. So they are all inevitably tangled together as a result of imperial commitments. Whereas the Germans, if they're the descendant, the Prussians, they either go west or they go east or they go south. Their army just has 3 decisions to make on the points of the compass, and that's sort of it. And they don't have to sail anywhere and be delivered anywhere or have their victuals brought to them. By another service, so it's just not programmed into them at all. Yeah. And then you layer in the way Hitler runs the Nazi state anyway, which is with two people in all the top jobs. You know, even the SS operating as competition against the army, absolutely. And and so on. Yeah. They're never going to do it, are they? It's again, like you say before, the success of May 1940 seeds their their future failure.
Yeah.
That just the simple way they embark on everything can only really ever lead to it unraveling, I think.
It's overconfidence, and there's no checks and balances in their system. And our system is kind of less spectacular in terms of perhaps innovation or complete failure. It's somewhere more in the middle, but the performance sort of is slowly going up. And in a crisis, people tend to stick together rather than thinking, right, who will get blamed in the inquiry afterwards? Who can I leave it to?
Yeah, that's such a good point. Yeah. That's such a good point. Just to go back to the kind of the Royal Navy at Dunkirk in that amazing week. I mean, of sort of proper warships, you've got 41 destroyers. That's the sort of the biggest component. You sort of think about Wolfhound, Icarus, Verity. The guys who are commanding these ships, they're all super good, aren't they? I mean, there's not a weak link there, is there? I mean, all of them are professionals. They all know absolutely what they've got to do. All of them kind of step up, don't they, in that week?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's universally true, and that they're all regulars. And that after the First World War, where you had a contraction of the services, so you have a real kind of richness of professionals who are there. Lots and lots of sea time, lots and lots of experience that just allows them. It's the simple things like, really congested water, working in that, and simultaneously, how do you cope with evading an air attack without going aground? And a lot of that, really, really sort of deep professionalism that you need to get you there.
So, Steve, if you're a destroyer captain on Operation Dynamo, I mean, you're going to have 15 years in the Navy at minimum?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
10?
Probably, because
20?
you're joining up pretty young. So actually, you're looking more like 20 for most of these guys.
So and in that time, you've served in the Mediterranean Fleet, haven't you? You've been out on probably in the Far East, at a Far East station at some point.
And all your officers were experienced from the First World War as well. So you're going into a culture that's just done a war as well. So the sort of experience goes with that talent as well.
So they use this phrase SQUEP, suitably qualified and experienced personnel, is the catchphrase to go with stuffed.
That's great. Two fantastic acronyms we've had chatting to you, Steve. That's just brilliant.
And the sort of the literal depth of the SQUEP in these people is phenomenal. And they'd been through, as you said, a very careful training programme. Most of the officers will have joined up at 14 at Dartmouth. So they've done sort of seamanship from being children. They've done time on cruisers, destroyers, battleships. Yeah. They'll have been rotated around the fleet. They'll have done their staff courses at Greenwich. So whereas I think the German armed forces have, probably the edge on the kind of innovation and expansion element, at that kind of tactical level, good at fighting, and all the things you've talked about, good at massing a kind of combined arms battle. That sort of thing. What you've got is a real leavening across, I think, all the British Armed Forces of that, essential core professional competencies that keep the BEF in existence as formations in the large part, that allow the destroyers to come and do these unexpected jobs in unexpected conditions. And that also, of course, put the Royal Air Force over Dunkirk on a large scale. So again, it is intimately tri-service, and the ships often aren't seeing it. But of course, one of the key things is German attacks are often being broken up by Spitfires. So the destroyer can cope with an attack from 2 or 3 uncoordinated aircraft in a way that it would find much more difficult if it was a dozen carefully coordinated aircraft coming at them. So every element is contributing.
I suppose but the point about the Navy is when we think of Britain at the start of the Second World War, we kind of think they're kind of not quite up to it. But that's because we're so land-centric, isn't it? And our total outlook is about the army is your metric by which you judge the kind of performance of one's armed forces. But actually, because we're an island nation, because we've got the empire and the rest of it, actually the metric for Britain really absolutely has to take into account the Air Force and the Navy. And in the Navy, we are really, really good, aren't we, Britain? I mean, the Royal Navy is really incredibly professional, incredibly slick, lots of experience, well equipped. There's kind of not much to kind of sort of worry about on that front, is there?
I mean, overall, absolutely. We've got our blind spots like everybody else. So obviously, as you know, one of the things with, say, aircraft is we go into the war without as much defence or offence for aircraft for the Navy as you might want. But that's partly because even 3 or 4 years before the war, aircraft didn't have the performance. As you know, it's only this sort of rapid waterfall of where aircraft suddenly increase their performance as several different, stress metal and engine technologies kind of all together. But again, the Royal Navy are operating the largest number of aircraft carriers of any Navy at the start of the war. We've got ASDIC, which isn't as good as we would hope for as the battle goes on, but we learn to adapt it and bring radar and this sort of thing. Our anti-aircraft gunnery isn't quite as good as we would hope because that's one of those things really hard to practice in peacetime. But again, that is adapted kind of quite quickly. So I think overall, its performance and its ability to adapt is really kind of impressive. And to bring in large numbers of merchant navy or normal civilians in who are commanding ships, 3 or 4 years after they've been normal civilians and achieving quite incredible results.
Well, Steve, that's absolutely fantastic. What I always love about our conversation, Steve, is there's never a conversation I have with you about Second World War where I don't suddenly think, that's a perspective I've never thought of before.
That's the great thing about the Second World War as a topic. There's just endless stuff and interesting connections. Stuff and stuff.
Yeah.
Exactly as you like.
Stuff and stuff. Brilliant.